Class 13. The main objective for this class is to create a responsive web design for the pages that you've already created for your final project. At this point, you've created your proposal page, but now we want to be able to take that proposal page and turn it into the opening page for your website and make it so it scales successfully for mobile devices, tablets, laptops, and desktop viewports. In order to do that, we are going to be using what are called media queries to target specific breakpoints. In other words, different screen sizes so your web page looks easy to read on all of the different size viewports that people use. You can see down here at the bottom of this page, I have some example media queries, and we see that a media query starts with the @media and then in parentheses the minimum width of that media query. In other words, the rules that you have inside of a media query only apply to your screen when your screen is at a minimum width of that specific number of pixels. So for example, where we see minimum width 768, we would have some rules between these curly braces that only get enacted between the width of 768 pixels and the next media query, which starts in this case at 992 pixels. So essentially you have different sets of rules for all of your different screen sizes. Now, while that sounds complicated, you actually have most of your rules at the top of the screen, and that applies to all of your pages. The only times that those rules that are above your media queries change are when you have rules within these other media queries. And I'm going to show you an example of that right now. The example I'm showing you is one that I've provided for you on the Module 13 set of pages. It's the bare bones responsive multi-column final project layout set of code that I've provided for you. And you can see that you've got your basic HTML set up. It uses our HTML5 semantically correct tags, header, main, article, nav, footer, and then we've added our standard, we've added a set of cascading style sheet rules. And we can see on line 1 it says mobile device rules. So basically the way you set up your rules when you're doing responsive web design is you use the philosophy of what's called mobile first. So all the rules that start from line 1 and continue on until we see our first media query, which is at line 75. In other words, all the rules from line 1 until line 73 here, those apply by default to your page. They get overridden when the screen size gets larger than 768 pixels. So from 0 pixels in theory to 767 pixels, all of these rules apply. And they're things that aren't going to change because of the fact that they're just kind of your boilerplate things. Your background color, your font families, your paddings, your background colors for your footers, for your articles, your borders, your text alignment, all of that stuff is pretty default, and that's not going to change. Now we see here there's a navigation set of rules here, and we see that we have a nav rule that applies to the unordered list, so it's a descendant selector, and we see that that unordered list has its display property set to flex and its flex direction set to column. And if you remember from last week, this is the parent of the list items, right? These are the list items over here. But what we see is that it says flex direction is set to column. well, this isn't set to column, this is set to row. Well, that's because we're looking at a large screen, and these are the default values. So if I change the screen size, we see all of a sudden those navigation links are now a set of columns. So the unordered list is display flex, and the items within that list are now set to column instead of row. But as the screen gets bigger, there must be a rule somewhere in one of those cascading style sheets that changes this flex direction from column to row. And that's the power of responsive design. We see right here on line 43, it says flex direction column. Well, when we look down to our media query, we see nav UL gets changed to flex direction row. So this is where the concept of the media query has to kind of land with you. Everything from line 1 to 74 are the rules that are applied by default. When the screen gets bigger than 768 pixels, the rules that we see in here are overriding other rules that are listed in lines 1 through 74. And the example I just gave you was the navigation on line 43 where flex direction is set to column. Well, that gets overridden when the screen gets bigger than 768 by this rule right over here where it says on line 93, flex direction is now set to row. So that's how we change from a horizontal set of links to a vertical set of links. You'll also notice that the navigation and the header have a new rule. Once the screen gets bigger than 768 pixels, it says sets the order flex order property to -1, meaning that that's going to show up first. Well, why do we need to do that? Well, you'll see here in the code, the navigation is at the bottom of the HTML. So when we see this in a mobile display, what's happening is that we're sending the links to the bottom of the screen. And the reason for that is when you're on a small screen, you want to see the title first before you see your navigation links. So that's another thing that's changing in this media query. The other main thing that you see changing is the number of columns. So we see that when we get to a display of greater than 768 pixels, the articles have their flex property set to 50%. Now, 50%, 768 pixels should be right around there. So we see article has flex set to 50%. Here's the first article, here's the second article, and this down here is a section or an aside. So when we see the next media query, which is bigger than 1024 pixels, the article has its flex or width set to 33%. So when we have a bigger screen, all of a sudden we have 3 columns. So the responsive design allows us to change the number of columns very easily by employing these media queries. So let's get back to that whole concept of media queries here and then move into the specifics of the final project. So we've talked about creating media queries and setting breakpoints. And we saw my example of the media queries and breakpoints in this code right over here. Well, actually, we saw it on this page right over here. It's a very similar layout, so I will go over to my Phoenix Code Editor where it's a little easier to see. These are all our mobile first rules. These are the rules that apply by default. So when the screen is small, that's the rules that we're seeing that are applying, right? But when the screen gets bigger, we're changing our rules only for the specific implementations that we will need. So for example, we see flex direction for the flex direction is set to column down here instead of rows. We also see that the flex wrap is set to wrap instead of no wrap, which is the default setting. And we also see that for the navigation system, which we see down here, flex direction is changed from the column setting that we see for the small display to the row setting that we're seeing for when the screen is bigger than 768 pixels. The other thing that we see is that the articles are set to 50% width. That's what the flex value is. And we also see that the aside is set to a flex of 30%, and we also see that for a large screen the articles are set to 35%, and we're not changing the aside at all. So once we get into a larger display, we see that we have 35%, 35%, and now 30%. That's what we're seeing right over here. So those are the changes that we're making in each of the media queries. The most important thing that can kind of make things challenging for you when you create a media query is that media queries have an extra set of brackets. When you call a media query, you say at media screen, and then within the parenthesis, the minimum width that that media query applies to, and then you open up a curly brace. Then you set each of the sets of rules that you want for that media query, and you close that curly brace. So there's an extra set of curly braces for each media query, and you have to make sure that you've got those in place for your media queries. So what specifically do you have to do for this next week? Well, you've already created your project proposal, and you could use that page as the starting point for your home page. You have to change the content in it and identify your sources for what your project is going to be about, your final project, and you want to get your visual imagery for your final project site. You need to create an initial responsive multi-column page design, including your global navigation, naming all of your pages, and an identity graphic and specific content for that site. So that being said, let's take a look at how we're going to do that and what are the steps involved. Well, the first step is to take your class 12 folder and module 12 and duplicate it and call it module 13. And then watch this video on creating an identity logo. And it's very easy to do. And then once you've done that, you start collecting your content for your page. And here's the thing that's going to make this very easy. I've provided a link, and we'll see that right down over here. These are the tags your page has to include. These are the CSS properties your page has to include. But I've created a link for you right here where you can use this template and change the template so it suits your project information. In other words, you've got the HTML code, you've got the CSS code, everything inside of this, including the color scheme, has to change depending upon what your project is about. So the first step is to obviously identify what your project is about. You already did that last week. Now you have to start collecting imagery and information related to your subject, and you have to create that identity graphic. Once you do that, then you can go here and copy and paste this code into your module 13 folder as your opening index page. So that's what I'm going to show you here. Here I am in Phoenix Code Editor. I'm in module 12. Here is my proposal page. Where to my proposal page. Here's my proposal page right here. We see I've got a proposal, I've got information architecture, I've got my word cloud, and I basically copied this and duplicated it. And here in module 13, what I did was, with that as my starting point, I created a page that has the information of my topic, including my identity graphic. And you'll see that what I did in the process of watching that video on how to create an identity graphic, also known as a logo, I've created different logos so I can experiment and see which one I like. So I can say, okay, well, this is what logo 4 looks like. Let's see what about logo 3. Okay, it's a little different. What about logo 2? Well, that's for a different idea for a website. And that is also for a different idea for a website. I think I'll stay with the logo I started with. So you want to make sure to create your identity graphic, put it in your assets folder inside of your module 13, and start collecting information about the subject that you're going to be presenting on. And as you can see, as my page gets bigger, because I'm using the styles that I provided on CodePen, you can see I've got 2 columns for the top, then I've got a separate couple other columns down below it. And then as it gets smaller, my navigation system changes from a set of horizontal links, goes down to the bottom of the page and becomes a set of a stacked set of links. And instead of having multiple columns, I have simply a single column, which makes it easier for people when they're looking on a mobile device. And you can see my image continues to get smaller because I have the image property set in that set of rules that I provided for you. I have my image property set in the mobile first rules as a maximum width of 98%. So even if the screen is tiny, that image is never going to get bigger than 98% of the container within which it is placed. So it is extremely important that you get going on this project, that you get that final project, utilize the final project template code that I provided for you here, collect your information, create your identity graphic, and then go through the steps that we've been going through every week in terms of posting your work. The other thing that you have to do aside from that is you're going to have to take this little quiz on the HTML5 semantic elements, the CSS box model, and Flexbox. That's pretty much what you've got for next week. I look forward to seeing your work.